What are the possibilities of my strength? That is a thought I have never had before. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the 11th episode of season 7, and today we are following up our discussion of Cocaine Bear by starting a new series dedicated to animals in horror. All right, so a few things up top. Obviously, from the intro, you could tell that Matt cannot join us for this episode, but I really enjoyed the discussion with him about the recent movie Cocaine Bear. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend it. He'll be back with us for future episodes. And that intro that Mel read, the quote, is from Hellhound, a novel by Ken Greenhall, which came out in 1977. It was recently reissued by Valancourt Books, and it's under their Paperbacks from Hell series, which I know I'm a fan of. I know Mel's a fan of. Matt's a fan of. I'm pretty sure all of our listeners are. So one of the kind of fun things about the book Hellhound is it's not about the supernatural creature, a hellhound, as the title might suggest. I think when it was re-released, it's come into print several times. So the Valancourt book keeps the original title Hellhound, but I think it also has been issued as Baxter, which is the dog's name. But it's actually about a killer bull terrier dog. So I thought that was kind of a fun way to kick off this new series we're working on here, because we're not talking about necessarily supernatural animals. We're not talking about cryptids, which we've done in the past. So you're not going to hear us talking about werewolves or, ghostly dogs from hell that are coming down. This is really just about what happens when nature goes wild. So we're gonna, in this episode, kind of like we do with a lot of our series, we're gonna kick it off by first kind of exploring why it may be scary, why this works so well in horror, and we're gonna take a brief look at the history of animals in horror before we kind of continue on with the series, where we're gonna, pick a few key books and movies to talk about. So I don't know. I thought we'd just kind of take a stab at why animals are scary. I kind of laughed when I was describing the Greenhall book, because the idea of a bull terrier being a vicious killer kind of made me laugh. Mel, I know you have your own little kind of fur baby dog. I've got one. We're definitely animal lovers, so it's hard to imagine them being cold stone killers. But I don't know, Mel, what do you think? Why are, if we're talking about just run-of-the-mill animals, we're not talking about any, big bad supernatural creature here. Why do they work so well in horror?
Well, I think it's interesting that he chose that dog too, because as we both know, because we have dogs, and I'm sure listeners know have dogs, there have often been debates about how certain breeds might be dangerous, which probably has a lot more to do with the dog socialization and training, but that is something that kind of pops up, it seems like, in phases over the years. But yes, I do have a little mutt, like a 30-pound terrier mix, and she hasn't attempted to do me in yet, so I think I'm going to be okay. Um, you know, I feel like the reason animals are scary, and I think, in our notes we listed stuff that when I think of animals, I almost don't think of like insects. If that, I don't know why I'm dividing that. I guess there's like the animal world and the insect world, I guess, but we also we're batting around insect examples. So I don't know, maybe when nature attacks might be a better way to put it. But I feel like there's probably a few reasons why that works in horror. At first, when we talked about this, I was thinking to myself of a lot of like mutated or even supernatural animals. But when I really got to pondering, I also came up with several experiments or several examples of what could be just regular old animals kind of run amok. I think probably the one that pops into my mind the most, and when I'm thinking about this kind of thing, which I'm sure we will talk about when we start listing some examples, is like Daphne du Maurier's The Birds, which ultimately was made into a Hitchcock movie. I mean, there's nothing more kind of normal than birds. They're around us all the time. And, I mean, I know some birds. I've had a bird who thought I was after its nest, like come after me, but I didn't really think it was going to do me in. And so I think a lot of it is animals are in our daily lives. We see them all the time. We live with them. And so if they have like rabies, for instance, or something we can't explain happens and causes birds to not act properly, or if you think of Patricia Highsmith's giant snail horror story, The Quest for blank Claveringae, th- you don't expect these things to be dangerous, but then the protagonist is put in a situation where they could be. And I think it's scary because it's the ordinary things that we think we understand and don't have to worry about turning into something that could be scary or that we have to worry about. It's also that idea of the weird, like maybe we can't explain why this is happening. It could be something that explainable like rabies, but it could also be something else, something that's inexplicable, or just like we also don't know all the animals in the world. There's lots of animals in various places, or if you think of like creatures at the bottom of the ocean, like we have maybe haven't seen yet too. So the idea of like not thinking we understand everything, but we don't, and danger could come from those places as well. And, I mean, even though we do a lot of damage to nature and the animal and the insect world, they still are all around us. And they're just everyday kind of things that we're not paying attention to. And when that becomes scary or a threat, I think it can become very overwhelming. Maybe it's also like a little bit more real than like a supernatural horror aspect, too. I mean, it kind of puts it more front and center. Those are just a few of the things that I thought about with this. Lisa, what were some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot of along the lines of what you were thinking, Mel. It reminded me a lot. Now, you use the phrase kind of when nature attacks or when nature goes wild, and we've talked about that in the past when we've talked about like the wilderness, kind of getting away from civilization and like what we think of as our safe world. We're used to seeing only animals that are cute and cuddly that are running around. We're not used to seeing ones that could actively do us harm, except maybe behind the glass or the bars of the zoo. It's one thing to kind of look at a lion when I'm taking my kids through the zoo. It's a completely different thing if I were to encounter one, just on my daily walk in my neighborhood, which of course I laugh because that sounds absurd. Like, the worst thing I'm going to encounter is maybe a dog that is barking at me. So I do think it kind of shares that element of wilderness horror, kind of the idea of getting away from the safety of our everyday life that we've kind of this cocoon that we've built around ourselves. I think it shares a lot with eco horror too, which we've also talked about, this idea of um, the world kind of taking over and moving on past humans. It shares a lot with apocalyptic horror in that way too, now that I think about it. Because the when you really think about it, there are a lot of animals, and I mean we're including insects in that, as you mentioned, that could be dangerous to us. Um, for instance, on that, I was joking about taking a walk in my neighborhood, and the worst thing I see is a barking dog. Well, dogs have attacked people. I think it's pretty rare for them to do it in a way that would cause significant damage, but it does happen. Um, I think about things like snakes, for instance. Snakes don't bother me. It's not one of my phobias, but I'll tell you what, one got into my yard the other day and scared me to death because suddenly I was thinking, wait, I need to know how to identify this. I got scared because my dog wouldn't leave it alone. Speaking of dogs. Um, and I was trying to get the dog inside the house away from the snake, and at the same time, kind of get close enough to see, is this a bad snake or a good snake? Is this a snake that could cause like me or my animal harm? Um, is it venomous? Is it not? What's going on? But really, when you think about things like that, there's a lot of potential for us not to be as safe as we could be. So I feel like that certain kind of terror. I don't know how we want wilderness horror is, I guess, kind of the big umbrella term if I was going to put everything in it, or like something outside of civilization. It to me fits in that kind of when the world attacks. Um, it's anything that's going to threaten our safety, that we kind of take for granted. That's the best way I can think to describe it.
I wonder too if there's also this idea of animals and insects kind of as our other. Unfortunately, as humans, we often kind of prioritize ourselves in the world, not really realizing how important other beings can be. But I mean, I'm super creeped out by spiders and insects, even though I know intellectually that they serve purposes. I don't want them on me, um, and I think there's this idea of the other, like that you can't communicate with them and you cannot fully understand them. I mean, especially something that's that kind of alien to our way of thinking of ourselves and being. We've socialized dogs and cats to a certain extent where we can create relationships with them. And I do feel like there's reciprocation there, but we also have a tendency as humans to anthropomorphize animals too. And, you have the warning to tell people, like, if an animal is wild, it's wild, and you don't want to like go up and pet it or something like that, or bother its babies. um and I wonder if there's an innate fear that maybe we have all the time and just don't really pay attention to because we cannot communicate with these creatures. So if something does happen that causes them to like go wild or attack, or if they feel threatened and they attack, it's terrible to have a human attack you, but there's a communication aspect to that. Whereas a wild animal or even a domesticated animal that's in pain or is in fear can lash out, and there's not a lot of like being able to understand what's going on. Like if you're getting bitten by a swarm of some sort of ants, they're not explaining it to you, and you can never, there's no connection there. And I wonder if that also makes it scary as well, because there's that gap in understanding what is happening, and it often ends up just being like lashing out on both sides.
Yeah, I really like that idea of framing it in the way of the other too, which I think is kind of a trademark of this kind of like wilderness horror, or when civilization falls horror too, because the the standard tools, in this case language or communication, of what makes us human doesn't apply. um we When we have domesticated animals, it does. We have that, right? I mean, Mel, dogs are very intelligent creatures. We can, you can give them very simple commands and they'll do it. I think I read something that said like a dog has an average intelligence, or like vocabulary, of understanding of like on the level of a human, like 2 or 3 year old, which makes sense because I can tell my dog, like, go get your ball and he'll find it. Or I can say, it's time to eat. He sure knows what that means. Or I can say, go get in your bed and he'll go do that. Like he knows those very basic th- things, commands. But I think any kind of real meaningful conversation might fall, and I would worry in like a life or death situation that he wouldn't be able to understand. And so I like what you're pointing out there of this, like it's very much a human versus other, which honestly reminds me a lot of our alien discussion that we had too, about what really is so terrifying about the idea of like an alien visitation, for instance. And it's that idea of something that is other than human. And what does that mean when you strip that away? So I really kind of like that. I like that way of thinking about it. Well, I don't know. Should we jump into like a little bit of the history of scary animals in horror and um, kind of trace this line up to current day?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy with that. I know you, Lisa, you started throwing ideas into our document, and one of the things that you mentioned was something like Moby Dick, which you checked and was published in 1851. I can't remember when The Hound of the Baskervilles was published. There's a hellhound feel to that, but I mean, they also treat it as if it's a real dog. I think both of those would work. I'm just not sure. I peeped around a little bit and I wasn't able to corroborate if there was something earlier than, say, Moby Dick. There's got to be. Were there any like gothic books that had like animal attacks in them that you know of? Just, I know I hate to put you on the spot, but I was just wondering.
um, I was trying to think of what could work as, like, if we're going to pinpoint, because when you're talking about the history, you've got to try to like pinpoint, like, okay, what was the first, or what was around when we started really seeing this. And of course, listeners, Mel and I are, when you have a PhD in literature, you have a very narrow focus. So sometimes our research is fast and furious for this podcast, and we've probably overlooked something. I mean, hopefully not something like too obvious to us, but my background is in British literature. Mel's is in American, so we're both kind of firmly in the English language literature, and we're both kind of tied to certain time periods. I couldn't think of anything in the Gothic. I mean, you have animal associations like vampires, for instance, associated with bats, but that seems to be, I would put that on the supernatural side of it. Um, there's a very vivid scene I remember in The Monk, the Matthew Lewis book, where there is worms crawling in and out of a dead body. um, I won't spoil the like grossness and disturbing nature of that scene, listeners. I'll just encourage you to go read the book and find out for yourself. But the worms aren't there, like they're there for the scare factor, and they're not supernatural at all, but it's obviously like a reminder of death. And I feel like when animals that are not supernatural have appeared prior to that, it was like a death omen type thing, which I don't know if that classifies as what we're talking about. I looked into things, like I was trying to go through my Shakespeare knowledge. Was there any, animals in that? Obviously going back to like Greek and Roman mythology, there are a lot of animals, even in something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they're usually supernatural. It's like the bull of heaven, or it's a god transforming into an animal to come down. So it's not the same thing that we're talking about here. I know in folklore, wolves, for instance, are a real big staple, and that kind of, I think, is representative of like the dangers that are out in the wilderness. Um, but as far as like a published piece of work where you have something that is presented as, a thriller, horror, whatever, where the animal is the antagonist, Moby Dick seemed to be one of the first ones, and that's even, I feel like, kind of iffy. That's 1851. Um, yeah, I don't know. A Hound of the Baskervilles turned out to be an explained supernatural, so it was kind of in that Gothic tradition.
Yeah, it was a trick
Um,
with a regular dog.
right, it was, but that kind of fits. Um, for a while I was grasping at, like, Pose the Black Cat or something like that. But again, I don't think that
Mm.
that really fits. I feel like when we started to see really true, dangerous, scary animals that were appearing in specific like novels and stories and movies, it really was, I mean, kind of after the Island of Dr. Moreau, Mel, which I think you had mentioned when we were researching this, which would have been right at the turn of the century. Now, that's not exactly what we're talking about, because to me, it is kind of a cheat too, because it's like an experimentation, almost like they are kind of monstrous, supernatural, even though they're not. It's a weird, I don't know. But I feel like once you get into the 20th century is really where you start to see these animals taking on the role of, like, this is the antagonist, this is the monster, this is the villain, and it's just a regular ordinary animal that has, for whatever reason, turned violent.
Yeah, I mean, if we were looking for something to predate Moby Dick, it would have to be Poe, I would think. Because he would have been writing in 1840s. I did when we started throwing insects into the mix, I found this recent British Library publication. It's a collection of horror stories about insects. It's called Crawling Horror: Creeping Tales of the Insect Weird, and it came out a couple years ago. And even though insects totally creep me out, I'm actually contemplating maybe getting this book now because it just kind of sounds interesting. And the first story that it has is The Sphinx by Poe, which I actually, that's a poster. I would have thought we took a Poe class in grad school, Lisa, but I don't know. If I read The Sphinx, I don't remember much about it. Um,
I do not remember that story at all, and I'm like you. I thought we had like combed through every. If Poe wrote it, if it was a poem, if it was a short story, if it was a half finished novel, we read it. But
yeah,
yeah,
I
I
don't
don't remember
remember
the
that
Sphinx.
one. Yeah. And then the next couple look like they might be like the mummy obsession of the 19th century with the British. So there's one like the mummy's soul, another one, the blue beetle, a confession. But again, that would be your argument, like, the beetle being like an omen of death, or associated with the real quote unquote villain, which would be the, mummy or someone associated with the mummy. Those narratives could be kind of problematic, but it looks like, at least on the insect side, it takes a while before you get, though it says H.G. Wells had a scary story about a moth. Um,
Yeah, I
so,
was just about to bring that one up because I wonder, that was 1895. So that would have, I mean, maybe if we're going to include the Island of Dr. Moreau for our kind of early proto animal monsters, then that kind of fits. But again, a moth, I feel like, is another one of those. It's like the worm. It's like the beetle. It's an omen of death. So um maybe I yeah, that's, we'll call it, if we're not going to call it the first example, then maybe we'll call it like the proto. The like
I like this. Yeah.
what came before, the proto animal story. I feel like I feel like might fit.
I mean, of course, there's Poe's Murder in the Rue Morgue, which had an animal as a murderer, and I know I don't
Uh,
want us to get in all the details about that because it does have a problematic, you know,
yeah,
it has its issues that have gone through like critical, review over the years.
yeah, we're just gonna go ahead and call that what it is. That it's a racist story. But yeah, I don't. I mean, it technically would fit. I think. I don't know. When I think about really, if these are all kind of proto examples, um, then for me, if I'm looking at the first true one, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, but where it's by our rules here, I love my rules when I come up with um with a story like this, but where it's an animal that has no like supernatural attachments, okay? And this is why I think something like the island of Dr. Moreau might not fit either, because I want a normal, natural, kind of quote unquote natural animal or insect. I want it to have no supernatural attachments. I want it to have no experimentation, because even though I'm sure we'll talk about them, like the mid 20th century atomic movies, they're super fun to watch, giant insects, attack of the killer ants or whatever. Those are atomic creatures. Those have been changed in some sort of way. So I don't want to include those really. I mean, they're tangential and they're interesting to talk about in this discussion, but I think there's something different. I really think that it's The Birds by Daphne du Maurier. That was the first, because that was published in 1952. And as it's told, all it is birds attacking. Now, in the story, they have a reason for doing it. There's like a reason that they're attacking, but it's still natural. It's still a part of the natural world. Of course, in the movie, in the Hitchcock movie, we don't really get that explanation. We just know that they're attacking and it's really horrific. But I feel like that's really the first one that I came across, at least that I know about, where it was just a natural, normal animal that just suddenly turned and attacked.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, other than Moby Dick, but I guess that might not even totally fit your rules, even though I feel like the whale kind of acts like a normal whale. It's just being followed and tormented by Ahab. I guess you could say that the fact that they keep running into each other, um, and that it takes him
It
out
is
maybe gives it
that I was
something
about to say with
mystical.
something
It's
like
also the white whale, which represents all sorts of stuff as well. Yeah.
yeah, I mean with Moby Dick, is it the animal that's fully attacking, or is it, like you said, a whale just acting like a whale, and like Ahab would have been fine had Ahab let his obsession fall. you
Mm,
know?
that is very
Um,
true.
with the birds, you don't get that. It's kind of like why I think like Jaws, for instance, fits into this category. I know we've talked about Jaws a lot in our it's one of our favorite movies to talk about at summer around 4th of July. But with something like that shark, Jaws is not acting like a normal natural shark. Jaws is acting like a killer. And the birds in this case are acting like killers. Like there's no escaping them. Even in the story when they go inside the house and try to like board up all the windows and doors and stay away, the birds are relentless in their attacking. Like that's not the same with Moby Dick, I don't think.
I can see that. And she does offer the explanation. Well, nobody knows for sure in the story, but one explanation is that the weather patterns have changed, which are making the birds like not be able to. I mean, they're basically like starving. You're not ending up in the places they want to end up in when they're migrating, and so they're completely thrown off.
It's
So
an eco
yeah, there's
horror type, yeah.
yeah, they're not like freighted with supernatural meaning. They're just acting out because something is messed up in their environment. So they're just reacting in that way. Yeah, I could see that. What do you think about the Patricia Highsmith giant snail story? I mean, I know giant snails may not be a thing, but there's no experimentation and there's nothing supernatural. It's just snails got this big on this island.
I'm giving it to her. I mean, the quest for the blank clevering guy. That was also a story. I think we've covered both of these actually on the Monster She Wrote podcast. So, listeners, if you want to hear us further talk about the Patricia Highsmith story and the Demaye one, those are some fun ones to talk about. But yeah, I think so because I mean, it's a scientific quest, so they are natural. They're not there. It's, they're not like atomic creatures, and it isn't some sort of weird experimentation. It's just like, as you said, they happen on this one island to grow super big. And um, they're definitely killers. Now I don't know, maybe snails are too. We just don't know about it because they're smaller than us. But yeah, I would put that definitely in there. So that would be one of the earlier ones too.
Because that would have been
Which,
like the 1960s, I think.
right. I mean, because we get, like you said, just in kind of an overview, we get, the giant kind of nuclear toxic waste mutated insects a lot in like the 50s and 60s and even some into the 70s. But I feel like those were the earliest ones before we got into, I think from the 70s on, there was kind of a surge in killer animals, like just normal animals that turned killer for whatever reason. I really feel like those might have been the first. We mentioned Hellhound, which was from the 70s. There was also the Guy Smith series Night of the Crabs, which always kind of remind me of the quest for the blank clevering guy, talking about like, just normal, or even kind of the birds, because it's like if you see one bird, they're not terribly scary. But if you saw a flock of them coming towards you with murderous intent, it's terrifying. And it's the same thing with crabs, I think. Like if I see one crab scurrying on the beach, I'm not too worried about it. But if I saw hundreds of them like mobbing toward me, terrifying. So we've got that. Of course, we've got in the 80s, like Stephen King writing Cujo. Um, but we had Jaws in the 70s. We had Hitchcock's The Birds, which, when was that, in the 60s? I'm not recalling
I
when
think
his film
so.
adaptation of it was.
We talked about it. Let's see. Yeah, 1963.
Yeah, yeah. So I feel like, yeah, around the 70s was really when we saw the explosion. And honestly, I don't know if it's gone away. Well, Cocaine Bear being the perfect example, although that was human interference, I guess, technically.
Yeah, cocaine doesn't just come to bears naturally in the wild. Maybe
Except
in
for
the
the
21st
sled.
century. Yeah.
um well, I don't know, should we just go like pick, since we're talking about, I mean, that's the past, like, say 4 or 5 decades, um some of the standout ones for us, and do any of them stand out to you?
Well, I feel like, I already mentioned that the Highsmith story, which I think I mispronounced when I first said it. I remember when we did the episode on it, we practiced over and over again to make sure we got it right. But the quest for blank, clever, and guy, that one sticks out to me. The birds, of course, that's one of my favorites. The story, and I like the movie. And I feel like the other one that I thought of just immediately was Jaws. I feel like I thought of Jaws before Cujo. And I don't know, I feel like it's kind of the perfect, like, animal gone wild. Even though you can say, like, why does he keep going after these people? It's still they're going after him. So yeah, I feel like Jaws really works. I'm trying to think. Those seem like the ones that are stand out to me. I've never seen the 1970s Piranha, but I want to rectify that situation. I've seen movies with piranhas in them, but I don't think I've seen the granddaddy of them all.
Well, and I will highly recommend Piranha 3D, the one that was, the one that was directed by Aja. Um, I I funnily enough enjoyed that film. It embarrasses me to say that I enjoyed it as much as I did, but, um, yeah, speaking of it being the granddaddy of of kind of the killer fish films, yeah, I liked that remake. Well, some that immediately I think came to my mind were, besides, as you said, Piranha, Arachnophobia. I remember that one from the 90s really terrifying me. The 90s had some good ones that were like animals being brought in from other places and let loose, which I guess is kind of going back to what I was talking about like this outside danger, or to use your term that you're talking about, Mel, this other danger creeping into what we perceive as our safe lives. I think arachnophobia fits, because just having a spider lurking around that can kill somebody so quickly is pretty creepy. I still have not brought myself to rewatch that film since the 90s because it did scar me so badly. Although I have a feeling it would not hold up today. That's just me. I don't know. But something else just came to me as I was talking about it. I feel like something like Outbreak might even technically count, even though it's not exactly, it's a illness movie, like a contagion film, but it was started by a monkey out on the loose, which I think kind of puts it under this category. Um,
I hadn't even thought of that. Now you're opening this up to a whole lot of stuff
but okay, but
because
think about
yeah.
it. Think about it. We mentioned Cujo, right? Like, you talk about killer animals, you have to talk about Cujo. But why is Cujo attacking? Because of rabies,
He's rabid,
right? He's
yeah,
he's
yeah.
rabid, which is an illness, right?
Mhm.
So if that works that way, then shouldn't it work the other way?
Yeah, animals are unfortunately vectors of disease. But would that mean that a movie focused on the flu, if it came from birds, would that also fall under your new rule, your new rubric here?
If it was presented in the way Outbreak was, because in Outbreak, at least from what I remember, we tracked the monkey, right? And like all the little places he went.
No, yeah, the monkey got loose and was running around. Yeah. I've
So
only seen that movie once. It's been a while.
yeah, if it was like, like an avian flu, which, obviously those do exist in our world, then if we were kind of tracking the rogue bird, then yeah, I would put it under that. I mean, again, it's kind of a big umbrella, but I'm going to throw it in. And something else we talked about kind of debating, but Jurassic Park. Would you count Jurassic Park as a killer animal?
I think so. When I first saw it on the list, I was like, "Huh," but they're not kaiju. They're dinosaur. They were alive and they were animals on Earth at one point, and we brought them back. So it's not experimentation because they're not being changed. They're just being brought back to life.
It's just the reanimation of them, essentially.
Right, right. And then they're just going to take over the world again.
Right.
King Kong might work too. I know you mentioned King Kong because again, he's on an island and he's gigantic. I don't know. It's been a long time since I saw the original King Kong. There's other giant creatures on the island too, but it's kind of like the idea that they've been separated from everything and like
Yeah.
survived, right? Wasn't that the original
I think depending
definition?
on which version you're watching, we could count it. I think sometimes he falls under that kind of kaiju umbrella, but I think from the way he was originally intended, yeah, that he was just I mean, it's essentially the Patricia Highsmith story, right? He was
Right.
just on an island and is much larger than he's supposed to be, and we bring him back. We encounter him, we go out there and encounter him in his space and then introduce him to ours. So I would put King Kong in that.
With the Jurassic
Yeah.
Park argument, the original Godzilla might count here because in the original Godzilla, he is living in like in a separated place under the ocean where there have been remnants of dinosaurs that have survived, and he comes up because man is bothering him and he loses like his food supply. So it could count even though he's a kaiju. The original explanation for him was
There's
that he was a remnant that was like kind of like, we took his food and blew up bombs next to him and he came up and got mad.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument to be made that there's like a kaiju killer animal Venn diagram that has a bit of crossover. I'll allow it. If we're talking about just pure animals where we're not going to debate it, there's a lot of anacondas in movies, a lot of piranhas, a lot of barracudas. I mean, you could go and look at endless lists made of these things. There's a lot of alligator and crocodile films, Lake Placid and Crawl, just to name two. There's several like lion and tiger films where like The Ghost in the Darkness or Congo. Obviously, there are bears like Backcountry. Um, snakes on a plane. uh, but wolves, I think, are a particularly interesting one. And I want to throw out a film that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, and it's Frozen. And it's not the Disney Frozen. So go ahead and put the little asterisk there. There was a film that I came out sometime, I want to say in the early aughts. I don't know exactly. It could be anywhere. I don't know. Time has no meaning for me anymore because I feel like the 90s were 10 years ago. So it could be anywhere from like 2000 to 2015. And I realize that's a huge gap, but forgive me. But it's this movie where it's three friends, if I remember. It's been a while since I've seen it, but they are skiing on a mountain. They're like at a resort and there's a big snowstorm coming. And so they're about to close down the like ski run, and they decide that they're going to go on one last run down the mountain. So they get on the oh, I don't know what you call them, the ski lift. They're sitting on the seat and waiting to go up, but everything shuts down. And so they're stuck, just kind of dangling on the side of this mountain. And you find out that because everything's shutting down, that like people won't be back, like to turn on the thing for like days. So they've got to figure out a way to survive. It's survival horror. Okay. But one of the most terrifying scenes involves wolves. Um, and these wolves that kind of come circling, the pack of them. And that was the scene that I just really remember from that film. And it was good. That film was terrifying. It was very much anxiety inducing. I was skeptical because I thought, how can you make a film that's just like essentially three people sitting on a ski lift? Um, it was riveting. Again, I haven't watched it so in a while, so kind of like arachnophobia, maybe it wouldn't hold up, but that's what I have memories of. So I figure I might as well give that kind of a mention too, if we're talking about the history of this.
Well, you mentioned not the Disney Frozen, but there's wolves chase well, what's the word I'm looking for? Not apocryphal, but like the that main folkloric story we have of wolves chasing a sledge and trying to kill the people on it. Sometimes it's a bride, sometimes someone else. That happened in Beauty and the Beast, right?
Yeah. It
Yeah,
did. There was that scene where she it's actually kind of scary where she's going to save her father, who's been, I guess, locked up by the beast, and she is surrounded by the wolves. Yeah.
I think that's also in one of Willa Cather's books, maybe My Antonia. One of the people who's come from Russia, I think, tells that story. Louise Erdrich has a take on it in one of her books. Like a piece of folklore that kind of has popped up in a lot of stuff for a while. I guess it probably also influenced fairy tales too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know we were trying to like pinpoint, and I will still, just because you know how I feel about Daphne du Maurier. I will, I will use find any excuse to talk about her, but I still want to give her kind of the gold star for the kind of modern version of this kind of story. But I do feel like if we were looking at really the true kind of beginning of this, it would have to be fairy tales, right? It would have to be those folklore fairy tales, because the wolf is always the symbol of evil in the woods, whether it's Little Red Riding Hood or these versions of people going out into the woods and being surrounded by a pack of wolves. um
And it also
really,
has
really
so many
interesting.
meanings too, because I mean, it could be original, like the wolves are hungry and they're going to get you. Like nature is not, romantic with a capital R, but it also then can morph into even a sexual danger or other types of danger. Like they become metaphors for other things as the tales develop.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. I like that reading of it. um wow, I feel like this has been really good. I do want to give a last kind of honorable mention to Willard. um for his command over the rats. I always thought was um very good. I know I guess they're commanded by him, so they're that again, you have to say it's included under this huge umbrella. It's probably something to debate, but if we're going to talk about animals and horror, you can't not at least throw out Willard, right?
No, I feel like that is like the quintessential rat horror tale. There's also James Herbert's book, The Rats, from 1974. Did that influence Willard, right?
I,
Willard was an adaptation of that, I think.
you know, um, I'm not entirely sure. Um,
Maybe they didn't, and maybe they just came out around the same time.
well, no. All right, I'm cheating here, listeners. But if I looked at the Wikipedia page for the 1971 Willard, of course, I love
Okay.
also the remake of it,
It
with
was
Crispin
before the
Glover.
book, The Rats. Okay.
But
Okay.
it said it's based on a novel, a 1968 novel by Stephen Gilbert called Ratman's Notebook, about an unnamed social misfit who relates better to rats than humans. And it was the basis for the 1971 film Willard and its sequel, Ben, and then, of course, the 2003 remake.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
it looks like, at least according to this, that Valancourt Books, they're doing the best work when it comes to kind of pulling these underread classics of horror. They actually put out Ratman's notebooks a few years ago, and Kim Newman, the horror author, wrote an introduction for that. So, yeah, it looks like you could probably still find an updated copy of that, but yeah, this looks like this guy who can train the rats and use them for his bidding, so to
Like the
speak.
Pied
So
Piper.
the Pied Piper. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that fits. So yeah, that's kind of another stop in our look is 1968. That would certainly, Daphne du Maurier still is before it, but this is still an example of an early one before I think the boom that would come in the next decades.
Yeah, it looks like I am also looking at Wikipedia, so I'm not, I'll give a disclaimer there. But it looks like Herbert's Rats came out in 1974, and this claims he was inspired when he watched Todd Browning's Dracula, with the description of hordes of rats. So I have not read I have not read the rats, but I can only imagine. Yeah.
That just makes me shudder. And speaking of Wikipedia, one of the good things that I think you can use Wikipedia for, even though I wouldn't make it your final stop for research, but where it kind of gives similar topics. And this reminded me of Kiss of the Tarantula, the 1975 film, which
That movie
is,
is crazy.
yes, but yeah, has the pet spider. So,
I
again,
didn't even think of that, but that works so well. Yeah.
yeah. So again, this is kind of a subset now that we found that we didn't talk about before, but where you have animals that are under the control of, or that have been trained by humans to do creepy slash weird slash unsettling things.
In defense of the tarantulas,
No.
in Kiss of the Tarantulas, they don't ever, spoiler alert, they don't ever actually kill anyone. They just scare people to death. So there's that. I mean, I watched the movie, watch the Riff Tracks version. But like she commands them, but they just kind of dance around the people and the people kill themselves out of fear. I'm not saying don't watch
Yeah.
it, but the tarantulas are kind of maligned as killers. Not that I want to have a tarantula or anything. I'm just saying.
No, no. But yeah, there was of course, this is getting into now like the 70s and stuff, but there were quite a few of these. Um, I think there was one where somebody has pet snakes that they do, and then of course there are a lot about people, going out into the ocean and finding different types of fish and sharks, of course, but quite a few fun things that we could. Oh gosh, no, we could be dangerous with this because I'm sure we could keep this discussion going for a very long time.
I'm starting to think that this topic could just be a whole season.
I keep thinking of things and I'm like, oh, but this is endlessly debatable. Well, I don't know. I feel like this is a good place to stop. I did well, we gave our honorable mention to Willard. Maybe we'll throw out cat people too. I know we had talked about that. The original is kind of fun when we're talking about it. But I'm really looking forward to this series and to some of the ones that we're going to talk about. So yeah, listeners, I hope that you're as excited about this as Mel and I are. And we're really looking forward to when Matt comes back to join us so he can throw in his favorites as well. If you have some favorites that we didn't mention, we'd love to hear about it. You can reach out to us on social media. We're at No Fear Cast. Remember, that is KNOW. On Twitter and Instagram, we also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. All right, we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.